So we continue meeting the prophets. 2 weeks ago, when I started this series a week before Lent started, we picked up with Elijah, considered by many the most important, significant prophet in Israel's history. Elijah, who took on the gods of Baal, who took on the powers that be, and stood up to be counted. And at a contest on Mount Carmel showed the mighty power of God contrasted to the weakness of those who had put their faith in lesser gods. Last week we met Amos, one of my favorite. Amos, hot-headed, mad, because he saw the inequities of his day. And he was able to see, though he was uncredentialed and not necessarily well-versed when it comes to the more sophisticated matters of his day, he saw the nation based on such inequities could not stand. And he proclaimed it to the people. And probably after he died and after the nation fell to the Assyrians, they began remembering his word. Today we meet yet another prophet. Very different than the first two. A person of great compassion. And so when you come to begin reading the words of Hosea, there are those who would say, well, it's an allegory. There are those who would say it was this or that and the other. I'm not going to spend time debating what it is or isn't in terms of literature. But I think what the storytellers want when we come to these texts is that we read it and take it as it is. And what is it that the word's trying to say to us that may be meaningful to us? So let's just talk about the story as it goes. We don't know a lot of personal facts about Hosea. Apparently married to a woman named Gomer. And when we read the story, all seems pretty well. You know, there's the honeymoon stage, I guess. The first child comes along, and the first child is named Jezreel. Nothing that raises any alarms there. But then there's a shift. A second child is born, a girl. And Hosea names that child, she that never knew a father. Wow, that sounds like there might be a need for a marriage therapist in there somewhere. And then the third child comes along, a boy, and there's a bitterness about the naming process. It becomes obvious that there's serious problems because the boy is named No Kin of Mine. You think you've got problems on your family tree. Ponder that one, if you will. And then Gomer leaves and goes off to enjoy other lovers. Ending up, as the storyteller would have us understand, having sold herself into prostitution. Try to imagine Hosea in his culture and his time and his place. Terribly humiliated. Alone. In his dark night of the soul, trying to figure out what brought this about. How could I have failed, he must have asked. No doubt judged harshly by his neighbors who also were asking, well, what did he do wrong? It was a patriarchal society indeed. And so the pressure that Hosea must have felt was excruciating. And there were 3 children, at least 2 of whom he knew were not his own. And there he was. In the midst of this this sadness, in the midst of this pain, it's not lost on me that often revelation and light comes in the midst of our suffering. I used to always imagine when I was hurting the most that I was like the romantic poets. That surely I would, if I just drunk enough and if I just pretended to be the great poet, that I would have a wonderfully tragic end and be remembered. You know, kind of the Keats and Shelley thing. Except I realized that I didn't have their talent and I didn't have their budget to drink on, and so it goes. But in the midst of his pain, Hosea got a glimpse, a learning, if you will, a religious experience. And he began seeing and asking questions that came out of his experience, and began asking those questions about where God was for Israel. And it must have been hard for him to confront all of he was experiencing, but out of that came great light, great learnings. For one thing, Hosea began asking the question and getting an answer that God's love for Israel was exactly that took place between great lovers. Now, I know you've probably heard sermons before, because we preachers have worked it over and over again, moving into the Greek language, that there were like 3 words that get thrown around representing love for the Greeks. The Greeks were very specific people. And while we're dealing with the Hebrew Scriptures, we begin talking about images of love. Those 3 words, of course, were philos. We talk about friendship. And then we ironically get to the city of Philadelphia, where they would snowball Santa Claus. I don't quite understand how that had to do with those Quaker roots somewhere along the line. There, of course, was as preachers would tell us, the ideal version of love, agape, that self-giving, sacrificing love that oftentimes gets referred to as true love. But then they kind of blew by the one that made us uncomfortable, eros, which is one of the more beautiful pieces in that's where we get erotic. And what happened for Hosea is he began seeing God as a great lover of the people of Israel, just as he longed for and loved Gomer with all of his being. That's what love felt like. Now, I know it's hard for some of us. We're up the road on our journeys. But some of you remember early in life, in the spring of your life, and you felt the joy of the juices and the spring, and you met somebody and you just longed for him or her, and you thought, oh my goodness, if only, well, we don't need to fill in all those blanks. The power of feeling, of loving somebody passionately. Writing lovesick poems. You probably never did that. I did. I just never had the courage to pass it along. I figured I'd get a reject. But you just kind of, oh my, how that felt. Hosea began realizing that this was like God's love for Israel. What was the mystery of that love? Why would God possibly choose to love these people? Remember, Hosea was one of these people. As we move along the way and we find ourselves part of a community of faith, those who profess to follow Jesus, we could ask ourselves the same question. How was it that God, through Jesus, could love us with such passion? We're used to it being about earning our way forward, earning someone's love, that we are worth it. But in truth, we simply were created in the image of God to be loved by a passionate God. And that in itself is powerful understanding of what real love is. Love for love's sake. He also was forced upon to wonder why. Why would this happen? Why would Gomer leave a good husband like himself? Was it his fault? Had he failed in some way? What she didn't know almost killed her in the same way that what we sometimes forget almost will kill us. Harry Emerson Fosdick used to tell one of his favorite stories. I understood that he told it more than a few times. That's what we preachers tend to do. It was a story about a man who bought a ticket to go to Detroit. You know, I don't remember the destination since Fosdick spent a good part of his life in New York. Maybe it was from New York. Anyway, he bought a train ticket to go to Detroit. And he paid for the ticket, and he got on the train, and he rode and rode and rode. And when he finally got off the train, he was in Kansas City. He intended to go to Detroit, but no matter what his intentions, if you can't follow through with what you're doing and you don't keep track with where you're really going, you may end up somewhere that you hadn't planned on going. Gomer didn't realize that while she may have been moving away from someone that she felt somewhat neutral about or distasteful about or whatever it is, she didn't realize that the decisions that she made could end up being destructive and take her to places that she didn't want to go. How many of us have intended to go to, Detroit? Well, maybe Paul did. But we ended up in Kansas City where at least we got good steaks. Right? Why? Why would God love us in such a way? Why would God love Israel in such a way? Why would Gomer not see how much Hosea loved her? Hosea must have felt if only Gomer had really known, she would have chosen differently. Then there was the truth that Hosea also saw, and that is that God will not overlook unfaithfulness. There's a cost to unfaithfulness. But God's love will not be blocked by our unfaithfulness. God wanted Israel as a lover again. God wants all of God's children as lovers again. The problem is that we keep thinking that that love is about thou shalt not. And I don't care how many warped politicians try to stick those rules on courthouse walls across America because they got something going that they don't want voters to really know about. Discussion for another time. That's not who God really is, because those commandments were simply meant to help a people who were sojourning find some structure to form themselves as a burgeoning nation state, pre-modernism. What our faith is based on is not thou shalt not, but thou shalt love. And thou shalt love not only God, but God with all of our hearts, with all of our strength, with all of our mights. And Jesus would come along later and say, oh, and by the way, don't forget your neighbor as yourself. This God that we serve, this God whom we worship, this is a God who will never let those loved go, no matter how far we may travel. Take a look at how things end for Hosea. We don't know what happened in terms of how Gomer received it, but Hosea took shekels, barley, and wine, took the going price for a slave, and went over to the slave trader and gave that to the slave trader and said, I want that one. And bought his wife out of the slavery that was prostitution. We don't know when she got home how that story ended. But the storyteller wants us to know that's the way God is for us. Sometimes we may be less than we want to be. Sometimes we may chase around with our mind going 4,000 different directions and not clear about who we love or what we're about. Sometimes we just are ornery and just refuse to receive what God wants to give. And yet, what the storyteller wants us to know is this is a passionate God, a God who is a lover, who longs for us. Why, I don't know. 2 days ago, a young man who obviously doesn't understand anything about God took weaponry and walked into safe, holy spaces. And even those people may call God by a different name than we do, they're the same people that loving God longs for. And he began manifesting his hate and killing anybody and everybody in sight. It's not the first time it's happened in our world. Won't be the last, sadly. We live in a world where people deny who God is. We live in a world where people can't conceive a God of Hosea. And a part of our mission as God's people is to lift up the truth for all those who are miserable and angry and filled with hate. You may want to reconsider the narrative by which you're living. Because in fact, it's obvious that you don't know how much God really loves you. And you don't know how much God really loves those whom you are hating. It's a word that needs to go forth from every mosque. It needs to go forth from every church, from every cathedral, from every synagogue, from every temple, far and near. That this God will have us. And this God will long for us until the day we draw our final breaths. Amos was mad, rightfully so. Hosea should have been filled with as much anger, at least, as Amos. But in the midst of his dark night, he got it. God is love and will be so forever. May God help us take that in its fullness and live accordingly.